Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time center of pestilence, and welcome back to the Doctor on the YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss magic, mysticism, religion, the occult, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this video, we're going to be talking about what is paganism. This is part of my Occult 101 series, which is sort of the flagship series that I do on this channel, where I cover big esoteric and religious topics and break them down in a beginner-friendly way. This is one video that I'm surprised I haven't done yet. I thought I had done it, I haven't, and I think it's one of the most important videos I would make because as a Thelemite and occultist, I actually consider myself a pagan, and I think paganism is becoming increasingly relevant. I think often people have this conception that paganism is some outdated, primitive religion that completely doesn't exist anymore, which, first of all, just because something's old doesn't mean it's bad. When we talk about ancient people, I feel like people fall into one of two traps. Either they think that just because something's older, it means it's more wise and archaic and mystic, or that it's super outdated and has no value. The answer is somewhere in the middle, and paganism is a broad term. In fact, a lot of the ancient religions that we call pagan now didn't actually self-identify as pagan. So let's get into the word. So the first argument is that paganism is anything that is not Christian. I think the best rebuttal to this, which I'll link the article that I got this argument from below, is that would mean like Islam and Judaism are pagan, and I don't think that's correct. I really don't think that's correct. You can say that, don't think that's correct. The second definition is one that comes up when people discuss what they know is known as neo-paganism, which I'll get into that in a second, and that would be it is an earth-based religion. My argument against this is that that definition has some truth, but I think there are other things that make something pagan. I don't think just honoring the earth is paganism, though earth and nature reverence is a common theme that you're going to see in any sort of pagan tradition that has emerged. Another definition people use is anything that's polytheist. I even disagree with this because there are other polytheist faiths that I would not really call pagan. I think that the best definition for paganism, just based on my experience and what I've noticed, is that it's a European term. I stress that paganism is a European term because pagan, applying that to cultures that are not European doesn't really make sense because it is a fundamentally Eurocentric term, and I think we should sort of keep that to its lane. As well, polytheist faiths such as, say, Hinduism, which Hinduism is a little different because there are definitely theological overlaps, so they are both polytheist, but since Hinduism is a continuing tradition, not one that sort of, died out and then was revived later, Hinduism is a very different thing. Hinduism has very different infrastructure, a different history, and a different community, meaning that I wouldn't necessarily call Hinduism pagan, though if you are a Hindu who also identifies as a pagan, that is completely legitimate, and you're welcome to do the same thing. I would call them more like fellow polytheists. So first we've got the European, second would be polytheistic. So polytheism gets a little interesting because there's sort of two ways that you can take polytheism, and a lot of the online articles that explain this difference get it slightly wrong. So there's hard polytheism and soft polytheism. This is a big debate that you see in pretty much all modern pagan spaces. And they pretty much are whether all the gods, because we're using gods plural, are separate, distinct entities, or if they are sort of different faces of the same thing. This can be explained in a few ways, like say that there's one major force, sort of an ineffable force without a face, and there's a bunch of different faces to it, kind of like they're different masks of the same thing. Or that it's sort of an emanation down, and the emanation has different expressions, and those are the different gods, and that would be soft polytheism. As well, if you take an archetypal approach to paganism, which if you're, say, really inspired by Carl Jung, you may do, you may take a more like, they're archetypes rather than pure gods, in which case you're probably also in this camp, though of course your understanding is a little bit different. Hard polytheism, as I said, is when they're completely separate entities. As well, there are people who kind of fall into the middle, right? Like, say they think they are faces of the different thing, but they are still distinct. So when you go to, you say, work with or worship the gods, you're going to do it in a way that you are still interacting with them as if they are separate. Alternatively, you can do things where you see this a lot in sort of magic style invocations, which invocations are where you call gods into you ritualistically. You'll sometimes see, they'll list a god and then they'll say, also known as, like, let's say Hecate. I call to Hecate, also known as Luna, as Diana, as Artemis, as etc., 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 etc. And then you say, and known under many other names. So that's another way of sort of invoking. So even within self-polytheism, there are people who work with them completely individually, as if they were individual, even though they think it's metaphysically from the same sort of emanation, or the people who do the of many other names type thing. As well, it gets a little complicated when you get into something like Wicca, which Wicca is, of course, one form of paganism that pretty much everyone's familiar with. Wiccans believe in a god and a goddess, meaning that they are duotheist, two theists. They believe in the masculine god and the feminine goddess, and they will sort of work with different gods and goddesses under this mantle. Sometimes they believe that specific gods or goddesses are the god and the goddess, or they will sort of say all feminine gods are the goddess and all masculine gods are the god, meaning that that's sort of a kind of blend of these two paradigms together. And then another major distinction would be neo-paganism versus reconstructionism. So this distinction is pretty significant and one that you want to pay attention to. So paganism, we're talking about people doing it now, not like ancient pagans and ancient pagan culture. We're talking about the modern version. So there's sort of two ways to take modern paganism. The first would be reconstructionism. Reconstructionism is an attempt to completely reconstruct what people did in the past. So they will take existing pagan faiths that existed prior to the European conversion, which the European conversion was really, really complex. It was done over hundreds and hundreds of years, with Lithuania not even converting until after the year 1000. And with many of these pagan traditions integrating into the Abrahamic current, developing very interesting holidays. Like if you look at how Candlemas is celebrated, you'll notice that strongly parallels what is known as Imbolc in paganism. As well, if you look at Christmas celebrations across Europe, you're going to note that there are things like gift giving and Christmas trees, and those actually originate from various pagan holidays that were syncretized in. But Reconstructionism, an attempt to completely go back, turn back the clock. The most common and talked about example of this would be Ausatru, or any other form of Norse paganism, as those people really delve into historic sources and try to completely recreate the past. The other way is what is known as neo-paganism. Neo-paganism is more popular. There are more neo-pagans, though there has been an uptick in Reconstructionism over the past couple decades. But neo-paganism are new paganism. So this is sort of, instead of trying to turn back the clock and recreate what once was, which, you know, is a completely valid and legitimate thing to do, neo-pagans say, well, we're living in 2022. What would the pagans have done if they would have had modern resources? Like, for instance, neo-pagans often syncretize various pantheons. So as we know, there were, before the conversion, a bunch of different pagan religions. There wasn't one. There was not one paganism, and there's still not to this day one paganism. There are a bunch of sort of religions, traditions, and practices under one huge umbrella. So think of the pagan umbrella, and then under that you've got Wicca, Ausatru, arguably Chemeticism, Orphism. It goes on and on and on. There's a really long list of pagan faiths. And they say, let's mix the pantheons. So instead of being like, I will only worship the Norse gods, you could say worship some Greek gods and Norse gods, mix them together. Or you could do something like Wicca, where you sort of create a new religion using pagan principles. Pretty much anything that's a modernized version falls under this, or anything that sort of blends ideas from various cultures. Most pagan religions are neo-pagan. As well, neo-paganism is much more popular in the United States. I know in different countries, especially if you get into like places like Eastern Europe, things are really different and their pagan communities operate radically differently. So obviously, you know, it's gonna vary based on where you are. Even within the United States, like the popularity of different types of paganism vary across the country. Like for instance, you'll see a lot more of like the Norse paganism in the Midwest. You see a lot more like Wiccans in the Pacific Northwest, etc., etc. It depends on where you are and what's going to be around you. Another question is like, with paganism, how do you pick which paganism? So that answer is really complicated. If you want to become a pagan, you should think about what your goals are. What do you believe? Because even these different faiths have different vibes to them. So Norse paganism, it's kind of masculine, it's kind of rugged because the Norse people lived in this very harsh climate. There's a severity to it. Whereas something like, I'm going to use Wicca again. Wicca is an easy example. Wicca, though it is not love and light, that is a misconception. There is a softness to Wicca. Wicca is about that god and goddess. It's a fertility religion functionally. It's about the consort of the male god and the female goddess coming together. And so there's this very cheery, romantic tone to Wicca. For my practice, Thelema, which Thelema can be argued to be pagan under a few different arguments. That's a whole long conversation. I have a video on my Patreon about this topic where I get into it in a lot more depth. But Thelema has a much less nature-based approach to paganism and a much more ceremonial, ritualistic approach to paganism. A thing to note, different pagan traditions have different ways of celebrating and different holidays. The most common form of pagan holidays is what is known as the Wheel of the Year. The Wheel of the Year celebrates 4 solstices and equinoxes, there are 4 of those, and then the cross quarters. The cross quarters were added a bit later because more parties are fun, and that sort of celebrates the cycle of the earth. That actually is interesting because the Wheel of the Year pulls from a lot of different pagan holidays into the Wheel of the Year, whereas say if you're a different tradition, if you're, for instance, a Reconstructionist, like a Slavic pagan Reconstructionist, you're going to be celebrating different holidays. So every pagan tradition actually has different holidays. For Thelemites, we have a few holidays that are not on the Wheel of the Year, and we focus more on the 4 instead of the full 8, though there have been people who have tried to make a full 8-spoked wheel for Thelema. You know, depending on your tradition, you're going to be doing different holidays. So in terms of rituals, it's going to depend on what tradition you are. For instance, people who practice Druidry, people who practice Ausatru, people who practice Thelema are going to have very different ritual practices. However, it is pretty common for pagans to have ritual practices, though it is not required. I think on the internet, especially due to the rise of TikTok, a lot of people think that you have to be a magical practitioner to be a pagan. That's not at all true. You can be absolutely someone who does not do that and just consider yourself a religious pagan. Those two do not necessarily correlate. You can be a pagan who feels as drawn to ceremony or as pulled away from it. As well, I think another thing that people wonder about is priesthood, right? Because if you're someone exiting the Abrahamic framework, you're typically used to structure. You're used to lots of organizations, a clear pathway for progression, and an authority. And paganism doesn't really have that because sadly, paganism, unlike Hinduism of the East, was not just able to continue on and on. So that lineage was broken, meaning that our infrastructure was entirely broken. Different groups have tried to create their own infrastructure with varying levels of success. So there are specific practices that do have a sort of trajectory, right? Like say if you join the OTO, a Thelemic organization, there's a clear pathway up towards ranks. Or if you get into Wicca, there is a 3-degree structure, and so there's a pathway to becoming a priestess. But for some of these traditions, that infrastructure doesn't exist. Or if it's something like Ausatru, where they have sort of various groups that are trying to establish organizations, those all look different. As well, if you want to be a pagan, you don't have to join a group, you can be solitary. Personally, I wish there was like some huge network of churches like how the Abrahamics have, but sadly we're not there yet as a community. There are people who are working to make that happen though, and there are people working to create, networks, and I think the internet has been really, really good for that. I think in general, paganism reviving now makes sense. I think particularly during the pandemic when the occult really started booming again, that was because people were stuck inside and they craved something higher. I find that when times are hard and the world is a scary place, people crave meaning, they crave purpose, they want to ask those big questions, and I think the pandemic was a time when that really happened. And as well, since we're always on our screens and on Zoom, it makes sense that we would crave that return to nature that many pagan traditions provide. So let's talk about some through lines. Obviously, not every pagan tradition is about worshiping nature, but nature reverence is very important. Honoring the land is a big part of pagan tradition and culture. If you go to pagan events, you're going to notice that people talk a lot about the land and the beauty that they find in it and how that brings them joy and wisdom. There's a reason why different pagan traditions look differently depending on where they are. Another theme is ancestral reverence. So a lot of pagan traditions honor your ancestors in some shape or form. Obviously not all in the same way, and there are people who choose not to work with their ancestors for various reasons. That's your personal choice, right? We are not the pagan Vatican, so you can sort of choose what works for you and ignore what doesn't, and find your path based on what your personal will is. But ancestral reverence is very common. Another thing would be working with or worshiping gods. So pagans, as we are a sort of different framework, do work with spirits differently. As pagans, we believe in a lot of different spirits, and different traditions believe in different spirits, right? Like you see in some of the Celtic traditions, though Celtic as a term refers to multiple traditions, not just like the Celtic tradition. A lot of Celtic practitioners will specifically identify themselves as Welsh, Irish, Cornish, etc. Those may work with the Fae. Or if you're talking about, say, a Norse tradition, they may work with various Norse spirits. In Thelema, you bring in things like angels, right? Like you get different spirits based on what you're working with, but a common one is the gods, sometimes worked with as god forms, so that's a little bit different and a little bit more complicated. People tend to either work with or worship gods, and whether you do one of these two is your choice. So worshiping is that sort of classic veneration. It's honoring the gods, praying to the gods, finding gratitude, and finding what would be known as faith through the gods. Whereas working with is, instead of sort of worshiping, you have a sort of relationship, like a working relationship with the gods, right? Like say you'll do a ritual for a thing and leave offerings for a certain amount of time and sort of see how that goes. As well, pagans sometimes work with one god or multiple gods. There's a term called henotheism that I think is really interesting. Henotheism is where you believe in multiple gods, but you work with one. Arguably, you could consider some of the earliest forms of Abrahamic religion henotheistic. And many people do choose to be henotheist. In the classical pagan world, before the conversion, many people were. As well, you see people who are particularly Wiccans will work with a god and a goddess. They'll call it their patron or their matron. The idea of patronage is very common in paganism. That's like the god that you work with the most, the one that you're most connected to. Or there could be multiple. You could have 2 or 3 patrons. Or you could work with a large variety of gods, say 4 or 5. But some be like patron relationships, like say you worship some gods, but you work with others, right? So you have like a few gods that you really honor, you venerate, you see them as like, you know, someone that you worship, and then others that you more say work with for a period of time. And these relationships ebb and flow. Much like the relationships you would have with other people, relationship with deities change, they evolve, they adapt. And so someone's pagan practice can look radically different from when they're a new pagan versus a more experienced one. And since in the modern community, we sort of all share space, we all sort of share communities, it's not uncommon for a pagan to sort of switch their sort of sub-tradition. That happens, that's pretty normal. Someone I'm very close to used to really work with the Greek gods, and now they work with the Norse gods. Stuff like that's pretty common and is completely valid. And once again, you can pantheon mix, though there are some people who dislike the concept of pantheon mixing. It's not like all pagans all agree. There's no pagan Vatican. In fact, pagans, I've noticed this tendency, okay? Hot take. I've noticed pagans do tend to be pretty authority averse in general, sometimes to our detriment. But sometimes it, you know, creates a place where we can have various ideas and we can all interact with people of different ideas and sort of create interesting spaces, though it can be difficult when it comes to organizing. So, you know, take that with what you will. And generally, I mean, the pagan path is customizable. The pagan path is a different path. You know, when you decide to be pagan, you're most of the time converting unless you were raised by pagans, which is increasingly more common as the pagan community ages and, you know, starts having families. But for most people, it is something that they have to leave another religion to enter. And when you leave another religion to enter paganism, that's typically pretty hard. There's a lot of things to unpack. I know for me, there were certain fears that I had because I was raised Episcopalian. My dad and my mom were Episcopal. My stepmother was Mormon. That's a whole story time. We can have a conversation about that in another video. But I remember when I left that tradition, because for me, I was drawn to the magic and occult stuff first, and then eventually I sort of found the sort of pagan path and started identifying as a pagan. There was a lot for me that I had to sort of break down, a lot of narratives that were sort of stuck in my head that I had to work through. Even if you're someone who's converting from, say, Christianity to Judaism, there's a lot you have to unpack, and being a convert of any sort is difficult and hard, and there's a lot you have to work through. So my general advice, if you want to dive deeper into paganism, is to do some research. Look up all the pagan paths. Drawing Down the Moon is a really good book to look at because it sort of details the modern pagan community's history and where it emerged from and what those various sects look like. And as well, I would just start practicing, start experimenting, start reading text, and see what works with you, because gods are interesting, right? Some you may actually reach out to and they may not be the right fit for you, and that's okay. Or you may try out various ritual techniques, say you're gonna get into Norse Seder, and it just doesn't work for you. So then you experiment with something else. You try casting lots, and that ends up working for you, and you find that maybe it's a different pantheon that calls to you. Maybe it's a different path that calls to you. And that's okay. Paganism is an open-ended tradition, and it's not even one tradition. We're talking about like probably 15 different traditions right now. And so the big thing to do is to come in with an open mind, ask yourself the big questions about what you're looking for, and then once you have those answers, you can really find what path works for you. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I wish I could talk for a little bit longer, but I try to make my YouTube videos somewhat reasonably length. If you want me to make like a follow-up video exploring any of these subtopics or talking about specific branches of paganism, leave them down below. I'd love to make those videos. I take requests, so comment what you want to know below. If you want to support me, you can find me on a lot of platforms. I'm obviously here on YouTube, but I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Telegram. If you want to support me, I'm on Patreon. That's where you can get these videos about a week early. You get extra videos every month, ritual guides, and much more. And I also have the podcast Magnolias and Magic, where I go a lot deeper and give a commentary on the modern community. That's everywhere podcasts can be found. And I hope you found this video helpful. Like, comment, subscribe, and if you're subscribed for 93 days, you'll meet your holy guardian angel, and you'll never need to know what the word pagan means again. All right, have a good night.